Good afternoon and welcome to this Book at Lunchtime event on the Oxford Handbook of Dante, edited by Professor Emanuele Gragnolati, Professor Elena Lombardi and Dr. Francesca Sutherland. My name's Wes Williams and I'm the director here at Torch. It's a great pleasure to be able to introduce the third Book at Lunchtime of this term. Book at Lunchtime, as regulars will know, is Torch's flagship event series, taking the form of fortnightly bite-sized book discussions with a range of commentators. Please do take a look at our website and newsletter for further information about upcoming events. And if you do, you'll see that this event is also part of the Humanities Cultural Programme Dante Season, where we're putting on a number of events celebrating the life, the work, the influence and the enduring impact of this extraordinary writer. I'm delighted today then, first of all, to welcome two of the editors who will speak to us about the book. They are Elena Lombardi, Paget Toynbee Fellow and Tutor in Italian Medieval Studies at Balliol College, Oxford, and Francesca Sutherland, Associate Professor of Medieval Italian and a Tutorial Fellow at Somerville College, Oxford. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Also on the panel are two further scholars who have been tasked with reading this substantial work, and I think Francesca will wave it around later, and who will bring their own particular perspectives and expertise to bear on a discussion of the Dante Handbook today. First of all, we welcome Dr. Vittorio Montemaggi, Reader in Literature, Religion and the Arts at King's College London and Director of the von Hugel Institute for Critical Catholic Inquiry at St Edmund's College, Cambridge. Vittorio's research focuses on the ways in which specific works provide concrete possibilities for deepening our understanding of how human beings can explore, engage with, and relate to, or indeed express, the divine, with a primary focus on the works of Primo Levi and Dante Alighieri. Welcome, Vittorio. And finally, to broaden our perspective still further, and joining us remotely, we welcome Dr. Hannah Skoda, Fellow and Tutor in Medieval History at St John's College here in Oxford. Hannah's research focuses on the social and cultural history of the later Middle Ages, constructions of deviance, of which of course there's plenty in Dante's work, nostalgia, there's some of that too, and legalism in the period. And her first book, Medieval Violence, Physical Brutality in Northern France, 1270 to 1330, has become a reference work in the field. Welcome to you too, Hannah. In a moment, we'll start proceedings with a brief reading by Professor Lombardi from the book. After this, our commentators will present their thoughts on the book, coming at it from their particular disciplines. We'll then give Professor Sutherland the chance to respond to some of the points raised before entering into what promises to be a fascinating discussion between all of them. The event will then conclude with questions from you, the audience. So please do put your questions in the relevant box, and I will pick them up and they'll be relayed to me on my mobile phone, so I'm not doing emails, I'm checking your questions if you send them through to me. And I'll relay them to the speakers as we go along. So that's the sort of order of service, and I'd like to begin by passing over to you, Elena.
Thank you very much, Wes. And yes, I would like to read for about 5 minutes or so, a couple of pages from our introduction to the volume, which is called Dante Unbound, A Vulnerable Life and the Openness of Interpretation. And we start like this. Centenaries can be somewhat of an oddity, especially when they celebrate publicly the most intimate and lonely moment a human being can face, death. The anniversary to which this handbook is related celebrates the death of a poet in exile, exhausted, thin, macro, he calls himself in Paradise, who had just lost his political hopes and was forced to replace them with the staging of a divine justice that he didn't see in life. Most likely, he never saw his commedia legata, bound together as a whole work. At that point, Dante was confronting the effacement of the body, of whose resurrection he appears to firmly believe in, as did the culture surrounding him. Yet, As we read in Paradiso, he cherished resurrection not so much for himself, but per le mamme, per i padri e per gli altri che fuor cari, anzi che fosser sempiterne fiamme. For the mothers, for the fathers, and for the others who were dear before they became eternal flames. This is a passage in Paradiso 14. This extraordinary passage, in which the blessed hail enthusiastically the powers and beauties of the superlative resurrection body that awaits them, not so much for themselves, no, forse non pur per loro, but for those dear ones, with and for whom affectivity meant embodiment, meant a body to cradle, to hold, to look at, tints, or one may even say taints, the triumphal glory of paradise with nostalgia, with memory, and with a backward glance. This passage brings us back to the day in June 1265 when Dante was born in Florence, the second child of Alighiero II and Bella degli Abati. A newborn, for Dante, is a clot of flesh and divine inspiration, and, importantly, language. It is a fante, a being capable of speech. Like body, language, his native vernacular Florentine, is for Dante the cipher of his individualized humanity. Not only it is the cause of his very coming into existence, having brought his parents together, as we read in the first book of the Convivio, but it also evokes a rather feminine narrative of nourishing and breastfeeding in its being natural and unruly in opposition to the standard artificial grammatical means of representation and communication, Latin. Emerging from out of the body, language is also Dante's very tool and the object of an unending reflection and application, with the aim of turning that rather weak and inept vernacular into an instrument of high, or rather grand, literature, and to justify its employment in the exploration of the mysteries of nature and the divine. Dante is a master of his mother tongue, a blacksmith, like the troubadour Arnaud Daniel in Purgatory, a user and shaper of language, like he describes Adam in Heaven, who's inventing plurilingualism and daring expressionism, from the description of a flatterer di merda lordo, befouled with ordure. Now here the translator is being quite polite, I think. This is a flatterer in hell, but to the equally abyssal transhumanar, the passing beyond humanity. So his inventions are unmatched by any other medieval or early modern author. And now I want to read just a sentence from, or a short paragraph towards the end of the introduction, about our guiding principles. A guiding principle of this handbook has been to resist the temptation of celebrating a triumphant Dante by stressing the coherence and unity of the author and his oeuvre. Instead, the handbook is interested in letting another figure emerge alongside that more solid and consistent, one may say overly consistent, Dante. A Dante who is made open to interpretation, unbound from the shackles of completion and wholeness haunting it. As such, the handbook does not want to systematize. Instead, the handbook invites openness and the plurality of interpretation. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. Clearly the theme of the bound and the unbound may emerge as we go through. I'd like to hand over to Hannah now, if I may, to give us the first set of responses to the book. Over to you, Hannah.
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me clearly.
We can.
Thank you very, very much for inviting me to respond to this book. It feels like a great honour. And mostly, thank you for this wonderful book. Thank you to the editors, and thank you to the amazing lineup of contributors. It's a fabulous achievement. So what would I expect from a handbook? I guess I would expect a useful guide and something that I would potentially recommend to students. I would expect something that gave me an introduction. I guess I would have a sort of list of expected topics that I would think I would find in a handbook. I don't know, religion, poetics, etc. But the Oxford Handbook
Image is freezing.
tell us what to think. Can you hear me?
We can. The image is freezing now and then, but should we persist for now
Okay.
and see where we get to? You
Good,
got as
let's
far as the
keep
Oxford
trying.
Handbook.
Okay, I was going to say it does very much more than I would have expected from a handbook. The essays are often unexpected. They don't tell us what to think, but they stimulate fresh perspectives, and they are intensely Moorish. Dante himself stands so particularly within his time. And obviously I'm coming at this from the perspective of a historian, but of course he also stands above and beyond his time. Spatially too, Dante is a man of Florence, but he traverses physical and metaphysical space ad infinitum. And I think these essays really brilliantly capture this sense of specificity and of sort of stretching beyond. Martin McLaughlin's essay speaks of the ways Dante makes the writer Virgil into a character. And of course, Dante also makes himself into a character. He produces his own kind of palimpsest of Dante's. As Elena Lombardi puts it, Dante curated his life in his works. And what really struck me about the handbook was the ways in which seemingly kind of endless debates about life and context and about uncovering the real Dante and when we can find the real Dante in his work and all this sort of thing can be replaced by a much richer sense of a many-layered Dante, a sort of Dante in motion. And that begins, I think, to gesture towards what is really striking about this book. It doesn't try to map out Dante, to join the dots. Rather, it's about evoking echoes and resonances. And whilst I was reading, the most appropriate metaphor felt to be that of a soundscape, a kind of rich, resonant medieval city punctuated by tolling bells, each of which marks something authoritatively, but resonates and echoes across time and space, generating unexpected connections and memories, perceptions, new tonalities, amplifications, and sometimes clashes. I really loved Mary Carruthers' essay on reading. And I can genuinely say that the handbook generated for me new ways of reading Dante. To be a quote, active, responsible beholder, to pick up on Gervase Ross's phrase in his essay on the visual. Mary Carruthers, in her essay, shows how monastic writers stressed three qualities of meditative reading. And I'd like now briefly to suggest ways that these essays encourage these kinds of reading. So the first sort of aspect of reading in this monastic context is reading for delight, a kind of deeply engaged, delightful reading, quote, to ward off the attacks of the noonday devil. Well, given that I was reading this whilst laid low by COVID, I can attest to the richness of these essays to be read with delight. But the essays also reminded me that Dante should always be read with delight. His themes are ostensibly so dismal and so heavyweight, but these are texts to uplift. In this sense, Peter Hawkins' comments on smiles in Dante evoke the emotional warmth and the kind of emotional and spiritual generosity in the richest sense of these texts. The second medieval reading principle elucidated by Carruthers is about care. We should read frequently, we should scrutinize the words, we should chew over them, ruminate on them, a metaphor which of course is later picked up on by Montaigne. Mm-hmm. So a quick example from my own reading. I was intrigued by Diego Quaglione's essay on law. It's a rich exposition of Dante's commitment to the confluence of different kinds of law and divine justice. But the brief discussion of equity towards the end served as a sort of invitation to me as a reader to turn back to the Inferno and to wonder or to ruminate, chew over on whether there are kind of cracks in the schema. So to put it slightly differently, Dante's writing is obviously suffused with a sense of the complexity of human experience. On the other hand, law or legalism writ large reduces behavior to generalized categories. And as a historian, I see the 13th and the 14th centuries as shaped by a kind of more widespread sense of the need for equitable thinking, a sense that people needed to move beyond black and white legal categories to allow for the messiness of actual circumstances. So for me, this essay prompted a sense or a set of useful questions about the ways in which Dante takes legal categories and complicates them with this growing sense of historical equity. The third aspect of medieval reading is conversation and sociability. And what better manifestation of this than this book at lunchtime event? Currently, my own reading of Dante is stimulated by my interest in nostalgia in the long 14th century. So I'm interested in the ways in which nostalgia, a kind of nostalgic wave, emerged as a response to profound 14th century change. The Cacciaguida, of course, could be said to be emblematic of a wave of nostalgia in this period. But these essays, for me, provided me with new ways to ask Dante about the value of the past. I found rich reflections on the role of memory from Lina Bolzoni, the role of memory in the past as intrinsic to a Dantean poetics in Elena Lombardi's essay, the relationship between past, present, and future in an eschatological sense, Emanuele Granulati's essay, and so on. And I love Jennifer Rushworth's reflections on conversion and the non-linear palimpsest-like quality of Dante's work. And all these reflections prompted for me a kind of conversation, or a set of conversations between concepts, so between memory and nostalgia, conversion, longing, and so on, but also a conversation between the essays in the collection, a conversation between Dante's own writings, looping, swirling, and returning through time and space, and then a conversation between us all. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you so much, Hannah. We'll beam you back in again later when we get to the sort of wider discussion. But you've given us a lot to think about already. I'll pass over now to Vittorio for your response to the book.
Thank you, and thank you again for the invitation and for this wonderful book. In few passages of the Commedia does Dante express amazement as intense as he does at the beginning of Paradiso 19. Here, in the heaven of Jupiter, the poet says that what he has to portray has never been spoken, written, or imagined. What so amazes Dante is the fact that the eagle of justice, composed of a multitude of human beings, should speak in the singular, given that its meaning is in the plural. The image on the cover of the Oxford Handbook of Dante portrays the eagle that so amazes Dante in the heaven of Jupiter. And this, I think, is indeed beautiful, beautiful cover. I think this is fitting. I think this image is fitting. Through the editorial vision that has shaped the handbook, we have a book that generates an amazement similar to that expressed by Dante. Emanuele Gragnolati, Elena Lombardi, and Francesca Sutherden have offered us a gift that stands out in a special way amidst the many other excellent publications and initiatives to have been produced in this important anniversary year. I was asked to speak of the handbook especially from a theological point of view, and I start from the Heaven of Jupiter because it's here that some of the ideas that define Dante's theology are most compellingly expressed. Here, too, Dante's text presents us with questions, the compelling energy of which reaches well beyond the text itself. The most pressing of these is that of divine justice. Is this equally and fairly distributed to everyone? What if one has been excluded through no fault of one's own from direct contact with Christian teaching? How can it be just that one is thereby excluded from salvation? The response Dante receives to these questions from the eagle is as disarming as potentially destabilizing of Dante's whole project. As one might expect, the eagle tells Dante that there is no salvation if not through faith in Christ. Yet, at the same time, the eagle tells Dante that he is mistaken in thinking some human beings are simply excluded from salvation. The Commedia does not ultimately offer a definitive theological solution to the paradoxical tensions that these apparently contrasting positions generate. Indeed, the poem ends precisely with the realization that it is humanly impossible to offer such a resolution. In seeing God, at the end of the poem, Dante doesn't simply see the image of Christ or his own image, but our image, la nostra effigie, the particular incarnate image of all human beings. Whether or not we believe that Dante fully lives up to this vision in his work, the Commedia challenges us with it. I take it that it is part of our task, and indeed responsibility, as interpreters of Dante, to ask ourselves what it might mean, again and again, to respond to Dante's challenge, not in general, but in particular terms. What does Dante's challenge mean for us, now, individually and collectively? I believe that the Oxford Handbook of Dante fulfills this responsibility splendidly. Splendidly and provocatively in a profoundly generative way. At every turn, in both the structure and the content of the book, the handbook seems deliberately crafted to be both singular and plural. Its unity is in its diversity. Much Dante scholarship is characterized in one way or another by prioritizing unity in exclusive ways, whether this be by replicating structures of thought and indeed judgment inherent in Dante's own writings, or by presenting critical perspectives as ultimate arbiters of meaning. The handbook avoids this, and I think it needs to be really praised for it. And it avoids this by focusing first and foremost on Dante's own particularity. I find the opening sentences of the handbook both illuminating and disarming in this respect, and theologically extremely fruitful. We've already heard them, but if it's okay, I'll quote them again. Centenaries can be somewhat of an oddity, especially when they celebrate publicly the most intimate and lonely moment a human being can face, death. The anniversary to which this handbook is related celebrates the death of a poet in exile, exhausted, thin, who had lost his political hopes and was forced to replace them with the staging of a divine justice that he didn't see in life. So the handbook itself, from the outset, highlights divine justice as a central dimension of Dante's work, and does so in a way that can be true both to Dante's particularity and to our own, in the intimacy of the recognition of shared vulnerability. In that shared vulnerability is the possibility of engaging with Dante in relation both to his limits and to ours, and to the conversation that our renewed encounters can continue to generate through both celebration and critique in ongoing, open-ended, interpretive engagement. The individual contributions that focus more directly on theological themes encourage this open-endedness. For instance, Emanuele Gragnolati on eschatological anthropology, Elena Lombardi on poetry, and Heather Webb on language invite us to recognize such open-endedness in the resources Dante offers us for thinking about human embodied particularity. Peter Hawkins ends his contribution on Dante's Other Worlds by inviting us to recognize in Dante's imagining the afterlife a conversation partner in our own ongoing explorations of what other world might mean. Alessandro Vettori, in his contribution on Dante and religion, suggestively points out that the Padre Nostro at the beginning of Purgatorio 11 is possibly the first time that the penitent engage with the deeper meaning of the prayer. And in turn, I think this invites readers to ask again and again at each new reading what Dante might allow us to see anew for the first time. Bernard McGinn invites us to take the mystical dimension of Dante's work seriously as expression of a conscious exploration of divinity that aims to draw us in, not to tell us how things are, but to invite us to undertake our own exploratory journeys. I find great theological value also in the overall vision and orchestration of the volume. In the wider context of the volume, the contributions on theological themes and questions acquire even more theological interest and value. What the handbook as a whole compellingly invites us to ask is how theological reflection on Dante's work is challenged and enriched by the non-theological. This is a challenge not altogether unlike that of the Heaven of Jupiter. It requires, beyond Dante's own limitations and our own, genuine openness to encountering meaning and meaningfulness in all aspects of human existence, in all human experience and particularity. As Gervais Rosser puts it in his contribution on visual culture, Dante's work, like that of his contemporaries Giotto and Duccio, wishes to persuade us to appreciate the world by looking not just at the surface of it, but behind it too, while remaining true both to the worldly and the transcendent. The challenge, theologically, is as pressing for us today as it was for Dante. And the Oxford Handbook of Dante is an invaluable resource for helping us with this pressing task. Thank you.
Thank you, Vittorio. We'll move now then to Francesca to respond to the very rich responses that we've already had. And maybe, I don't want to press you, but you could wave the book around one more time because I'm not sure you were on camera.
No, I don't think I was, and then I felt quite silly doing it. So now I can do it actually on camera. So this is the image to which Vittorio referred. So I'll just hold it there for a moment while I say some thanks. So on behalf of all the editors, I really wanted to thank Wes Williams and everyone at Torch for this invitation, and particularly to Hannah and Vittorio for these really incredible responses to this book and to the project that, it was really such a pleasure for us to undertake as, three individuals who've known each other for a long time, but also, felt that this was an opportunity in a sense to kind of show something of our Dante. But actually listening to your responses, what I thought was so wonderful was to be kind of presented in a way with also an understanding, just the sort of generosity of you both as readers, and really that engagement that, Hannah, particularly you were talking about as reading that can be both delightful and incorporate care and, really take on board also this idea that with Dante we just have to keep on questioning even when we think that we've got something or that something has revealed itself to us. And I know I only have a few minutes, so I'm sure I won't be able to even touch the surface of the incredibly rich responses that you gave to the book. But I suppose I wanted to pull out a couple of things that really struck me, and I think one of them, first to begin with Hannah, was really this idea of the sort of Dante's palimpsest, or the palimpsest type Dante. And I think that really resonated with how, when we were thinking what kind of Dante this volume would bring together, and of course, the plurality that Vittorio spoke of was so fundamental as this guiding principle. I think that idea also, the palimpsest, and you mentioned a number of essays that also look at the kind of non-linearity and the resistance to kind of wholeness and cohesion that Elena began with. I think it really brought back to me again that sense of how Dante as well, we were trying to, maybe that was where we did have a sort of sense of wanting to resist that sort of more monolithic Dante that is always trying to, or in the way that he presents his works, also constantly rethinking and almost like correcting the past, or at least suggesting that there is, and it's that idea of teleology that we mentioned, or that is mentioned in several contributions in the book. And really to allow more that idea of, and it made me think when you were talking about the palimpsest, also this more of this kind of Dante as a kind of conglomerate, or this sort of accretion of things, rather than an idea that you would rewrite and therefore cancel something in the past. So it sort of fitted also with, Hannah, your interest in kind of how the past always does seem to kind of like, it never really goes away, but it also comes back in these fascinating ways. And it was interesting you mentioned Jennifer Rush Rossetto, because I was quite struck by that image that also she takes from Pre-Shaw of the kind of volcanic potential that actually also that has. So it's a mixing of metaphors, but I suppose it's this idea that the palimpsest, as you said, is also a really dynamic. It's not that we would even just kind of see those layers and appreciate the kind of, and that is also maybe something we were very hyper conscious about, of working also after nearly 700 years, not just of Dante being read, but also responses to Dante, and not wanting to flatten that existing scholarship, but also to find a way to at least sort of make some contribution to how Dante is, also being thought through and questioned. And I really liked, just to finish with a couple of things that struck me with Hannah's response before moving to Vittorio. I like the image that you gave at the end of also swirling and returning, because I think, coming to this question of error and errancy in the productive ways in which we can also read precisely, not necessarily in a kind of linear way, but also allowing ourselves this freedom to move around. And so this idea again of the kind of Dante, the multi-layered Dante, but a Dante that is also in motion, that you get these really complex intersections. And, it was wonderful also to hear Vittorio from the, really taking this idea of how you can also read this handbook with, or from, or together with a theological perspective, and see that in so many different instantiations. And I think, I'll let Elena also add anything she might want to when we come to discussion, but it really, again, I think I just found it incredibly sort of powerful in a way to think that was an experience for you as a reader, and that there was this way in which, as we'd hoped, the handbook did leave that space for a more, we make a reference to Roland Barthes, the idea of papillonnage or butinage, the thing that the butterfly does by moving flower to flower, which wouldn't have a sort of predetermined course, but that you could, allow maybe pleasure to be your guide and take that. And so I really, also appreciated very much how you also took us back again to those cantils in Paradiso 19 and 20, where really Dante's facing some of the most difficult theological, but of course, as you said, not just theological questions that still resonate today. And I think, again, that idea of the kind of the open-endedness also is the continual possibility of still asking those questions, and without resolving, without coming to a final point on the matter. So I really wanted to thank you again, both of you, for this real, precisely sort of generosity and also sophistication of responses that I think, if we could have imagined readers, you would be the readers that we would be absolutely delighted to have. So I think I've probably used too much time already, so I will now pass back to Wes.
Okay, thank you. No, we're in good time. And I would also say to others out there, please do send us your questions. Otherwise, we'll just carry on having a nice time here, which is also fine. I think I'd echo what you said, which is I found the responses both extraordinarily generous and careful, and there's that nice thing which Mary Carruthers does look at, which is where care and curiosity go together. And it seemed to me that your both of your responses were both curious and careful, and that was a very powerful way of setting the debate in process. One thing that you didn't pick up on, which I would like to pick up on, if I may, just as a starting point, is that both of you talked about justice, albeit from very different perspectives, and actually both of you talked about what is equitable, albeit from very different perspectives. And I wondered if we might come back to you two and ask do you recognize that as a kind of leading theme? I mean, clearly it's a theme in Dante, but was it something that you imagined people might pull out of the book as well? Or is it just that we have readers who've seen that? As I say, either the equitable question or the question of justice, of divine law and other forms of law. Could we start there with either of you?
Sure. I think that, well, as you said, justice is one of the great themes in Dante. And so I would hope that our handbook has all those great themes there somewhere. And as we were saying, that each reader can, in a way, follow their journey throughout the handbook and find the points that mostly interest them. What we have tried to do, and this obviously, we have left our contributors complete freedom. We have not told anybody what were our ideas on Dante or nothing like that. So very much the way that these themes are shaped in an open and, if you wish, vulnerable, not sort of martial way is often in the encounters of essays. And I think the theme of justice is touched upon in many different ways, from the essay on the law, on the one hand. There is the essay on exile, and the essay on exile shows how Dante is trying to present, so that Dante, exiled, in a way humiliated by his own town, is trying to present himself as the exuli meritus, so to rewrite justice, earthly and divine. But I think then the theme of justice just returns in many others, in many other essays, and together we can hopefully put together a puzzle on these and many other themes, many other guiding themes that is, in a way, yes, that is open and shows not only, Dante main route, but also the many possible ways we can.
Thank you. Francesca, do you want to pick up on this?
No, I mean, I would absolutely agree with Eleanor, but I suppose when you were talking about equitability, I mean, it also made me think, I mean, maybe another way to think of that is about how, if you have a sort of, I mean, it's too schematic, but a sort of way of checks and balances. And I suppose, again, I always see Dante, and also maybe the Dante that, then you explore in these really multifaceted contributions that actually, again, it's really hard, I think, in the end to come down on one side or another. And I suppose, I mean, I also find the question of justice in Dante really, really interesting, but also very problematic. And I think, personally, whenever we teach, the cantos that really deal with justice, they're the ones that I think also students find, in some ways, among the most interesting, but also the most sort of difficult in a lot of ways, and partly because, again, Dante seems to be really himself quite disturbed by the fact that the seagull will say to him, first of all, that you can't actually ask the question, but then, of course, he insists, and that's also what we want. But again, that there may be something that he's just going to have to, in the end, either accept, or if not accept, then continue to have to kind of be perhaps unsettled by, even and so I think, I suppose for me, what I find interesting again about something like justice is that actually it is unsettling, and there's a sort of sense in which it doesn't quite balance out. So maybe you do see that in the kind of having these different perspectives on it.
Yes.
I'd like to pursue the theme of justice just a bit more before we come to one of the questions. So Hannah, I'll put you on notice that I'm going to come back to the question of where Dante sits in relation to the longer story you said about the 13th and 14th century, kind of looking for a new model of what's equitable or what's just, if I remember rightly. So in a sense, where's Dante in his time, but also, as you nicely said, spatially kind of elsewhere. So I'll come back to you in a minute for that. But just one more question to you, Vittoria, about this sort of scene that you draw on with the eagle at the end. Partly because it's earlier in the Dante season, we encountered a film by Luc Péton. I don't know if you know this film, where it's a dance response to Dante, but where the dancers are actually in the presence of birds of prey live on stage, as it were, as well as a wolf and various other things. And and I was very struck then by the sort of animality or it took me back to many of the animal, bird, non-human, you talked about beyond the human images in Dante. And I wondered, I mean, clearly they have a theological dimension, and this eagle in particular. I just wondered if you might gloss the eagle a little bit more. I don't want to put you on the spot,
No,
but what else is the eagle doing there?
So many things. I mean, and even just in itself, clearly here the eagle is symbolizing justice, but in the comedy, the eagle symbolizes mystical vision, the only animal that was thought to be able to look directly at the sun. To some extent, poetry, going back to sort of some of the images in Inferno 4, St. John. And so there's so much in a way already. It seems to be this clear symbol of justice, and yet you only need to sort of connect it to a few other passages in the comedy, and that gets not destabilized as such, but enriched and complicated by these other sort of associations. So if we put some of that together, I do think that here Dante, in and through the question of justice, is also trying to address questions to do with mystical vision, questions to do with sort of belief in Christ, questions to do with how all of this can be expressed, if it can be expressed at all, in poetry. And you were mentioning sort of birds of prey, and there's something that we can think of this symbol as potentially violent. Certainly, it was that in history. Dante himself refers to earlier in the Paradiso to some of this history, apparently unproblematically. Dante does seem to endorse an aggressive justice or a violent justice in certain respects throughout his poem, and that I think is one of the reasons why we do find this text difficult. And there's the to jump a few centuries, the essay in the handbook by Lino Pertile on Dante and the Shoah reminds us, even the use to which Dante was put relative to the kind of violent justice or presumed ideas of justice in later contexts. So I think. I'm not sure this is an answer, but I think the question is very important because by reminding us of just the aliveness of symbols, but also the potential sort of aggressiveness of them. If I were to expand on some of the things I was suggesting earlier, I would want to go in the direction of it is more complicated even than I was suggesting, and there are some potentially troubling aspects of Dante's poem that we would have to take into account.
Yeah. Thank you. And I'm not just coming to you as an expert in physical brutality, but I wondered if we might come back to you as thinking about this question of justice both within the historical moment and in this larger story that about searching for some kind of equitable account of justice that you hinted at.
Yeah, I was. So I'm interested in equity in the sense of the kind of disjunction between the categorical nature of legalism and the law, the kind of black and white categories that it seems to be all about, and the really kind of messy complexity of human life. And it seems to me, from a historical perspective, that this is a period in which that disjunction is causing more and more discomfort and an anxiety in a range of contexts. So I guess I'd be really interested in putting some of the material from the handbook in dialogue with two recent books about this in two different contexts. The first is Joel Kay on the history of balance. I think it's 1250 to 1375, probably. And anyway, he's mostly interested in a kind of scholastic context, though he puts together a whole range of sort of discursive spheres very interestingly. But his argument is very, very broadly speaking to suggest that a way of thinking which says, one thing can be straightforwardly balanced out by another in a sort of arithmetical way is replaced by an increasingly subtle kind of nuanced sense over the course of this period that balance works in a much more complex, messy, sort of blurred around the edges sort of way. And that relates to law and legalism very, very interestingly. And I think it would be very striking to look for that here. That was the first text. And then the other is a book, which has literally just come out with OUP by Lydia Zanetti Dominguez, which is about justice in 13th century Italy, where she's really interested in the exercise of mercy. And an increasing sense that actually there's a kind of spiritual prerogative on those exercising law, dispensing law, to think about the complexity of human life and the moral complexity of human life, and the fact that law can't always respond to that in the way that sort of morally is demanded of it. So in that sense, I think this is just such an interesting period. And Dante is, he's kind of smack in the middle of this. And I think looking for the kind of cracks that he's engaging with and sort of drawing out in all kinds of interesting ways just struck me as a really interesting conversation, which was stimulated by this volume.
Thank you so much. Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I think we always have to keep in mind that the problem of justice is posited in the comedy is with the real bang with the real issue that is limbo. And Dante, and this is a conversation that Vittoria and I have had for a long, long time. Dante begins his comedy with this limbo that doesn't exist theologically. He invents, he adds bits and pieces, and he is profoundly troubled, but by what limbo is in the theology of his times, and is limbo a nice place? Is limbo a terrible place? It really depends on how you read this. And there is this extraordinary line in which Dante creates. So in limbo we have a fire. Che un emisperio di tenebre vincia. So there is a fire that overcame or is overcome by an hemisphere of darkness. So we don't know if the fire of limbo is actually shining or it's actually very, very small and it's enclosed by this hemisphere of darkness. And this indecidability of this line, you can read it both ways, is really also the indecidability of this first poetic coming of stage of Dante, saying, well, I will make a place where I put all the glorious pagans and the righteous people that are not Christians, and I make this place wonderful and beautiful and full of light, but it is in hell. What do we do with this? What do we do with Virgil? It is Vittorio who pointed out for me that Dante talks about grace, that there is some kind of grace in heaven because these people were so excellent and so extraordinary in life. So is absolutely, Dante sees the complexity and depicts it, I find. And that's why it is so interesting and provoking still to teach Dante and to write.
I'm very struck by your sort of movements when you're talking about the line, partly because, of course, when we're talking about Dante, at least the Commedia, we're also talking about poetry, where these questions of balance and justice and what can or can't be accommodated within a particular statement are poetic questions, or the questions of form, of rhythm, of beat, and so on as well. Francesca?
Yeah, and I was thinking, just also picking up again something Hannah had said about stretching. This idea that that's also what poetry can do, because it can become the most capacious thing for all of these, paradoxes and layerings. And I suppose the other thing that I was, it was really interesting you brought up the example of limbo, because I was thinking there is an interesting way in which that connects back to the Eagle of Justice, insofar as there's also this question around exceptionality. So all of these kind of laws and categories, and then what you do with exceptions. So limbo in a way becomes a kind of special realm, but still within hell. And then you've got everything the eagle says, and then you suddenly find out that there's a pagan in the eye of the eagle. And so that then what happens when that discovery is made, and that sort of this question of then how you fit exceptions, and maybe Dante himself is also always an exception as the viator, the traveller who is given this special dispensation. And so everything then is shifting again. And I always think of that moment, the other one that I really like of sort of the perspectival shifting is when, of course, he gets to the Empyrean and realises that everything he thought he was travelling towards has already enclosed everything that, and you have to, I mean, it's very difficult to conceptualise it, but even to try is sort of half of the process, I suppose, to getting probably not all the way, but as far as we can. So it just struck me that they're quite connected, actually, perhaps in this sense. So
Thank you. I think we should take at least one of the questions from the audience, and we have one from Marianne Saunders, who says, and I quote, "I'm struck by the last chapter heading Nachleben, or afterlives. How do you define what is or is not an afterlife of Dante?" And the question continues, because this is a concept which seems very much in keeping with the idea of the palimpsest, or of deconstruction not being about destruction, but sort of keeping things in, maybe again, some kind of balance, I don't know. But certainly, I guess in the first instance, how do you decide what is or isn't part of a Nachleben, part of an afterlife? I think that's a question for the editors to begin with.
a wonderfully difficult question, we can say. I don't know, let me think.
Well,
I suppose
with the Nachleben part, we really did not want to call it rewriting or Dante's fortune or reception. But really, the sense of what is still I don't know, alive in Dante, that you can almost sense it and repeat it in ways that are incredibly unexpected. So that's what we understood, what Nachleben and how the rewriting in turn affects Dante. So it's really a conversation. And then we have left it to our contributors, and they've done an amazing job, I must say, in just finding their way. Of course, there are more examples, more things, but that's a sample that I think in there works very well.
Thank you.
No, I mean, I would just add that I think it's interesting because I think that's probably the only section that looks like it could be chronological.
Yes.
Insofar as it does, it comes at the end and it's looking forward.
Yes.
But I think actually we hope that then when you actually read those incredibly rich contributions, that actually things are again more complicated. And I think just as Elena said, what part of the process there was this idea that then one precisely could actually go back to Dante and see again something that one hadn't seen before reading it, from that perspective. So to sort of not see it again, that the sort of movement would be from Dante forward, but that you could also then go back to Dante and rethink some things through that optic. So it fits very much with so I won't add too much more there. Thanks.
Hannah, can I come to you on this notion of a Nachleben? Because I wondered, or an afterlife, because I wondered with your very strong sense of this as about movement and swirling and turning in on itself, and I'm not sure whether you ever said smoke, but I had an image of smoke sort of moving around. It seems to me one of the strengths of this book is that it's not about, well, this person saw Dante like this and this person saw Dante like that and so on, and that there isn't a chronological sweep through the ages, Dante in the 16th century, Dante in the 17th, etc. But I don't know whether, if you like, as a historian, you missed that, or whether you were happier to not have to read in that way.
Well, to answer briefly, I didn't miss that as a historian. I found that completely intriguing. And in all honesty, the way I currently kind of operate as a historian, I think tries to acknowledge much more explicitly the way in which time itself sort of loops and swirls around, and we're entangled in the stuff that we're studying. So I do try and maintain a critical distance between the things that I'm looking at in the 14th century and myself. But at the same time, it's dishonest if I don't acknowledge the ways in which I'm entangled with that, and the ways in which my own experiences are interwoven with the things that I get interested in, et cetera, et cetera. And partly that's a question of subjectivity, but it's also a question of acknowledging that time itself is a great deal more complex, and what we're doing as historians is a great deal more complex. But I suppose, I mean, in the handbook, it struck me particularly for two reasons. Partly because I'm a great fan of Montaigne, and that's one of the things that I love so much about Montaigne. This sense of the self constantly in flux and in movement, sort of even beyond death and so on. And I found it completely intriguing to be encouraged to think about Dante in this way too, partly during his lifetime, but also beyond that, a sense of a kind of a Dante in motion. And secondly, I was struck by it really personally, just because of my own interest in nostalgia at the moment. And nostalgia, I think, is such a completely fascinating phenomenon because it isn't about linear time. It's not just about looking backwards and saying, weren't things great? No. But that's gone. Nostalgia seems to me a way of kind of acknowledging that time is this really complicated, knotty thing that you know, sort of pops up in unexpected ways and gets tangled up in unexpected ways. So I love that in the volume, and I love the way that it made me think about Dante in that way.
Thank you. I would always appreciate any opportunity to talk more about Montaigne as a Montaigne scholar myself. But I think you're right that actually that one of the things very right, that one of the things this handbook does is, if you know Montaigne, makes you think about Montaigne in an interesting, or you search for connections and also differences. And you know, there's the kind of mysterious absence of Dante in Montaigne, apart from every now and then, but certainly as a kind of shape and as a way. And I was wondering whether, when you were saying Dantean movement, you were sort of also hinting towards Montaignian movement, Stravinsky's work and so on. And I think there are real connections here that could be explored maybe another day. We have a few minutes left, though, and I'd like to turn to Vittorio on the question of Nachleben. And again, I don't want to be too directive and say, well, Nachleben's all about resurrection, really. But I wondered if you had any theological thoughts on either the whole question of the afterlife of Dante, not the whole question of the afterlife, otherwise we'll be here. But also as a way of approaching. So in a sense, it's something that you put at the end, but that I think you've actually consciously avoided doing that sort of approach. And I wonder what your response to that was.
So two things perhaps to say, you know, one, in general terms, I think very important, you know, what you said, that you wanted to have this section, but you didn't tell contributors what had to go in it. I think in itself allows whatever life or afterlife Dante has for the contributors was included. And that in itself, I think, importantly speaks to how this category can be generative. In specific terms, I was thinking again during the conversation now about Primo Levi and about the essay by Dino Pertile in the handbook, because I think one way of thinking about what we get in Levi's relationship with Dante is historically a very complex, you know, could provide a very complex lens through which to address this question. Because on one hand, you know, at the same historical sort of moment, one of Dante's afterlives, if life is an appropriate word there, is being used as an instrument of oppression. In a way that draws from his work, taking things that are in his work. So and we should acknowledge that. We shouldn't try. So at this historical moment, Dante is being used as an instrument of oppression. At the same time, part of his afterlife is offering resources to resist that.
Yeah.
And to me, sort of, if we had time, I think it could be really sort of constructive to think about this particular sort of moment of Dante's afterlives, and try and address your question through that.
Thank you so much. We are running out of time now, but I see you searching for something. Do you want to?
Yes,
Go for
can I
it.
have like
Of course you can.
1 minute?
I was just going to say, we'll hand back to you two to round off the...
No,
yeah.
I thought it would be perhaps interesting. At the beginning, I have read the first sentence of the handout, and I would like now to read the last because it's very meaningful. The last essay, as you perhaps have seen, is an essay about a feminist decolonial Dante by Margie Waller. Margie Waller was an amazing feminist scholar and Dante scholar, really someone who taught outside of the box all her life, like a real feminist activist, and sadly she died just after completing this essay. So here is what Margie has to say about the Commedia. But the Commedia's relational poetics, initiated by the intervention of the three female figures who were assuredly not a feature of Virgil's or Augustus' design for the Roman Empire, unfixes and de-universalizes the certainties dependent upon such centered spaces. The poem proposes interactive, non-hierarchical, non-exclusionary relation and community, and the interactive, non-hierarchical, non-exclusionary performances of gender and sexuality upon which they depend as the pan degli angeli, the bread of angels that nourishes life.
Thank you. That is a great moment to end on, not only to end the handbook, but also to, I think, conclude this discussion. And I would like, on behalf of Torch, to thank, first of all, our two extraordinary respondents. Actually, this has been both really enlightening, but actually also very moving discussion of this work. So thank you, Hannah, very much indeed, and thank you, Vittorio. And then, of course, thanks to you individually, but also you as representatives of all the people gathered in this volume, in this
and
great
Emanuele
work.
Gragnulati, who
And
wouldn't be here today, but is probably following us.
Yeah. So thanks all, and also thank you to all of you who are out there listening and responding, and hopefully will return to not only Dante, but also to the handbook. And I think just one more image. Right at the beginning, before we started, we were talking about the size of this book. And I was struck by your opening move where you said, Dante may not have ever seen himself bound as a volume. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the really interesting things about handbooks that we mentioned earlier is that actually many people will encounter them as scattered leaves. That, you know, you read this bit and then you'll read this bit and then so on and so forth. So there's something kind of nicely time swirly about that as well.
Absolutely,
it's that
yes.
it's not just the great big book, it's also the kind of way of reading that we do now where we read sort of interstitially and so on online and in other ways. I think, again, the kind of ways in which Hannah has talked about time and so on have enabled us to think about today. So, one more time, thank you all, and see you next time we meet for our next Book at Lunchtime.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.